By 2050, the map hanging in your classroom could be wrong. Not outdated, wrong. Borders redrawn, countries gone, new nations born from crisis. And the strange part is, we can already see it coming. Right now, in rooms most people never hear about, governments are quietly preparing for a version of Earth that looks nothing like the one we grew up with. This isn't a prediction from a science fiction writer. It's a pattern, built from climate data, population collapse, resource wars, and the slow unraveling of superpowers that once seemed untouchable. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the most obvious force reshaping the planet: water. Not oil, not gold, water. By the 2040s, dozens of major rivers that currently cross international borders are projected to shrink dramatically. The Nile, the Indus, the Colorado, rivers that entire nations depend on for drinking water, farming, and electricity. When a river feeds 2 or 3 countries and suddenly there isn't enough to go around, history shows us exactly what happens next. Not immediately war. First tension, then treaties collapse. Then, in the worst cases, borders start to move. Egypt and Ethiopia are already locked in a standoff over the Nile because of a massive dam upstream that could control water flow for over 100 million people downstream. This isn't a future scenario. This is happening today. It's simply a preview. Now add rising seas to that picture. Coastal cities that took centuries to build are projected to face regular flooding within the next few decades. Jakarta, one of the fastest sinking cities on Earth, is already relocating its capital to a different island. Not because of a single disaster, but because the ground itself is disappearing. When land vanishes, so do the people who live on it. And when tens of millions of people are forced to move, they don't just relocate quietly, they cross borders. They strain neighboring nations. They create political pressure that can bring down governments or spark entirely new ones. Some geographers believe this could produce something the modern world has never truly had to define: climate nations. Populations without stable land, negotiating for territory, resources, or recognition, the same way displaced nations have throughout history. It sounds extreme, but small versions of it are already unfolding in places like the Pacific Islands, where entire governments are preparing contingency plans in case their countries become uninhabitable within our lifetime. While the physical map is shifting, the political map is shifting even faster. For nearly a century, one country's currency and military presence have quietly held much of the modern global order together. But that grip is loosening. Rival powers have spent the last 2 decades building alternative trade systems, alternative payment networks, and alternative alliances specifically designed to reduce dependence on that one dominant nation. This is not a rumor. It is written into public trade agreements, currency reserve reports, and defense pacts released by multiple governments over the past several years. If that shift continues, the world doesn't just get a new leading superpower, it gets several competing centers of power at once. Historians have a name for that kind of world: a multipolar order. And multipolar orders throughout history tend to be far less stable than single dominant ones. That instability doesn't stay abstract, it shows up on the map. Look at the regions history calls flashpoints: the South China Sea, the Arctic, Central Asia, areas rich in resources, shipping routes, or strategic military value, where multiple powers already claim overlapping interests. As the ice melts in the Arctic, for example, entirely new shipping lanes are opening for the first time in human history, lanes that could cut shipping time between major economies by weeks. Nations bordering the Arctic are already racing to plant flags, build military bases, and file territorial claims on the ocean floor. A region once considered frozen and irrelevant could become one of the most contested borders on Earth. Now here's where it gets even stranger. Some of the fastest growing populations on the planet are in regions already struggling with limited water, unstable governments, and economic pressure. Meanwhile, some of the wealthiest, most stable nations have rapidly aging populations and shrinking workforces. That imbalance doesn't stay contained within borders. It creates migration on a scale the modern world has never fully managed, which means the countries that adapt, the ones that build new systems for labor, citizenship, and integration, could become the next centers of global power. And the ones that don't could find themselves overwhelmed by pressures they refuse to prepare for. Power, in other words, may not just shift between existing nations. It may shift toward whichever nations figure out how to survive this transition first. So what does the year 2050 actually look like if these patterns continue? Picture a map where a handful of today's borders have quietly dissolved, replaced by new regional alliances built for resource sharing rather than old political loyalties. Picture coastal regions abandoned, marked not by war but by water. Picture new trade corridors across the Arctic, reshaping global shipping the way the Suez Canal once did, and picture at least one new international body created specifically to manage the migration of tens of millions of people no government wants to handle alone. None of this is guaranteed. History rarely moves in a straight line. But every one of these forces, water scarcity, rising seas, shifting alliances, and population imbalance, is already measurable today. Not theoretical, measurable. Which means the world of 2050 isn't some distant, unpredictable future. It's being built right now, decision by decision, treaty by treaty, drop of water by drop of water. The only real question is which nations are paying attention and which ones are still looking at a map that no longer matches the world outside their window. Because maps have never actually shown us the world as it is. They show us the world as it was right up until the moment reality changes it again. And if history has taught us anything, it's that reality is never patient.